Many people say yes when they mean no. They stay quiet in rooms where they should speak. They agree with opinions they don't hold, laugh at jokes they don't find funny, and shrink their own needs to fit into spaces made by other people. This isn't weakness in the way most people think about weakness. It's a quiet, constant management of one fear. The fear that if they show their real self, people will leave. This fear doesn't announce itself. It doesn't feel like fear at all. It feels like being easygoing, being flexible, being a good friend or partner. But underneath, it's shaping decisions every single day, and over years, it reshapes character itself. Stoicism has something direct to say about this, and it starts with a simple distinction most people never learn. Before we go further, if you value clear thinking about character and self-control, hit subscribe and tap the like button. It helps this channel keep making videos that speak plainly about how to live well. Number 1. The fear that doesn't look like fear. Fear of abandonment rarely looks like fear. It looks like agreeableness. It looks like a person who never causes trouble, who adapts to whatever the room needs, who seems endlessly easy to get along with. Other people often praise this person for being low maintenance, for being flexible, for being easy to be around. What they don't see is the constant internal calculation happening underneath that calm surface. Every opinion is measured before it's spoken. Every preference is checked against the question, will this cause distance? The person doing this rarely names it as fear because it doesn't feel dramatic. It feels like good manners, like maturity, like simply being considerate. This is exactly why it's so dangerous to character. A fear you can name, you can face. A fear that disguises itself as a virtue slips past your own awareness and quietly directs your life without ever being questioned. The Stoics were precise about the difference between what is up to us and what is not. Epictetus opened his teaching with this exact division, because he understood that most human suffering comes from confusing the two. Whether someone stays in your life is not up to you. You cannot control another person's choices, their moods, their loyalty, or their capacity to remain present. What is up to you is how you act, what you say, what you value, and who you choose to be regardless of the outcome. The fear of abandonment collapses this distinction. It quietly convinces a person that their own character should bend around the uncontrollable variable of whether someone else stays. This is a philosophical error before it's an emotional one, and correcting it requires seeing the error clearly. Consider how this plays out in ordinary situations. A man disagrees with a friend's plan, but says nothing because raising the disagreement might create tension, and tension might lead to distance. A woman lets a partner make a decision that affects her directly, without stating her actual preference, because stating it might start a conflict she isn't sure she can survive. A young employee watches a colleague take credit for their work and stays silent, not out of professional strategy, but because confrontation feels like it might end the relationship entirely. None of these are single dramatic moments. They are small, repeated, almost invisible choices. But character is not built in dramatic moments. It's built in exactly these small, repeated choices, made consistently over years. This is why Marcus Aurelius wrote to himself, in private, about the difference between what other people think of him and what he knows to be true and right. He was not writing for an audience. He was reminding himself, daily, that the good opinion of others is not the measure of a good life. A person governed by fear of abandonment inverts this completely. The good opinion of others, and specifically their continued presence, becomes the primary measure of whether a choice was correct. This inversion is subtle enough that a person can live their entire life inside it without ever recognizing what has happened to their own judgment. The deeper cost is that this fear doesn't just affect specific decisions. It reshapes the entire structure of a person's inner life. Values stop being fixed points that guide action and start becoming negotiable positions that shift depending on who is in the room. A person who values honesty stays honest with people who reward honesty and grows quiet around people who don't. A person who values fairness speaks up about fairness only when it's safe to do so. This isn't hypocrisy in the usual sense. It's something quieter and sadder. A person genuinely trying to hold onto their values while systematically letting fear edit which values get expressed and when. Stoicism doesn't ask a person to stop caring about relationships. It asks a person to stop confusing the outcome of a relationship with the measure of their own character. A person can care deeply about staying connected to others while still holding, as a separate and higher priority, the commitment to act with integrity regardless of what that connection costs. These are not opposites. They only feel like opposites to someone who has spent years treating the fear of losing people as identical to the fear of losing themselves. The first outline of understanding this problem is simply seeing it, naming the pattern, recognizing it in daily choices, and accepting that what looks like kindness may sometimes be quiet self-erasure. Number 2, where the fear comes from. Fear of abandonment usually has a history. It often traces back to early experiences. A parent who was inconsistent, a caregiver who withdrew love as punishment, a childhood environment where connection felt conditional on performance. These origins are real and worth understanding. But Stoicism offers a specific caution here, one that modern conversations about trauma often skip past. Understanding the origin of a pattern is not the same as being permanently governed by it. The Stoics distinguish between what happened to a person and what a person does with what happened. The first is often outside anyone's control. The second remains, always, a matter of present choice. This distinction matters because many people get stuck at the explanation stage. They correctly identify that their fear of abandonment came from somewhere real, and then treat that identification as the end of the work rather than the beginning. Knowing why a fear exists can become, ironically, another way of staying inside it. A person says, "I do this because of my childhood," and then continues doing it, as if naming the cause released them from responsibility for the pattern. Epictetus would call this a confusion of categories. The cause of a disposition is one thing, entirely outside a person's control, having already happened. The maintenance of that disposition in the present moment is something else entirely, and it remains, every day, a live choice. This is not the same as blaming a person for what shaped them. Nobody chooses the conditions of their early life. A child who learns that love is conditional did not choose that lesson. It was taught to them by circumstances beyond their control. Stoicism has no interest in blaming a person for the wound. Its interest is entirely in what happens next, in the years after childhood, when the person has become an adult capable of examining their own patterns and choosing, deliberately, whether to keep living inside them. This is actually a more respectful view of a person than either blame or excuse. It assumes they are capable of change, right now, regardless of history. Marcus Aurelius often reminded himself that the things happening to him were not the problem. His judgments about those things were the problem. Applied here, the early experience of inconsistent love was not, by itself, what destroys character in adulthood. What destroys character is the ongoing judgment, repeated daily, that says, "I must avoid anything that risks someone leaving, at any cost to my own honesty." That judgment is not fixed. It was formed once, under specific conditions, and it can be examined and revised the same way any belief can be examined and revised once a person is willing to look at it directly instead of treating it as simply how things are. There's also a quieter danger in over-identifying with the wound. It can become an identity rather than a history. A person starts to think of themselves as someone with abandonment issues, and this label, meant to explain a pattern, ends up reinforcing it. The label becomes a kind of permission slip for continuing the very behavior that damages character. Stoicism resists this kind of fixed self-labeling generally. It treats character as something built through ongoing choices, not something fixed by diagnosis or a past event. A A person is not their history. A person is what they choose to do, starting now, with full knowledge of that history. None of this requires pretending the past didn't happen or that it doesn't still influence present reactions. It simply requires placing the influence in its correct category, real but not determinative. The past explains why a fear is present. It does not excuse allowing that fear to keep making decisions that a clear-headed adult, examining the situation honestly, would recognize as harmful to their own integrity. This is the second piece of understanding, separating the origin of the fear from the ongoing choice of whether to keep obeying it. Number 3, the daily erosion of honesty. Character is not damaged in one large event most of the time. It erodes the way a coastline erodes, through thousands of small repeated actions that individually look harmless. The fear of abandonment operates exactly this way. Each single instance of silencing an honest opinion to avoid conflict seems minor. Each single moment of agreeing with something a person doesn't actually believe seems like a small social kindness. But these moments accumulate, and what accumulates is not neutral. It's a slow transfer of authorship over one's own life from the self to the anticipated reactions of others. Consider the mechanism carefully. Honesty requires a kind of steadiness, a willingness to say what's true even when the listener might not like it. Every time a person avoids this because of fear that the listener might withdraw, they are training themselves, through repetition, that avoiding honesty is the safer and more rewarded behavior. This is a real psychological process, not just a moral failing. Behavior that avoids a feared outcome, especially social rejection, becomes reinforced and automatic over time. A person who has done this for 10 years often cannot easily locate their own honest opinion anymore, because the habit of checking what will keep this person close has run for so long that it now happens before conscious thought even engages. The Stoics placed enormous weight on the idea that a person's word and a person's true belief should match. This wasn't presented as an abstract ideal, but as a practical necessity for a functioning mind. A person whose speech consistently diverges from their actual judgment develops a kind of internal split. Part of them knows what they think. Another part of them manages what gets said. Over years, this split widens, and the person can lose confident access to their own judgment because it has been so consistently overridden and hidden that even they struggle to locate it clearly when it matters. This erosion also affects a person's relationship to conflict itself. Someone who has spent years avoiding disagreement to prevent abandonment doesn't just avoid specific disagreements. They develop a general aversion to any friction at all, treating even mild, healthy disagreement as a threat to be managed rather than a normal part of honest connection between two separate people. This makes them increasingly unable to hold boundaries, unable to say no clearly, unable to correct someone who has wronged them, because all of these actions carry, in their mind, the same weight, the risk that the other person might leave. What's lost in this process is not just individual instances of honesty. It's the underlying capacity for honesty itself, the way a muscle that isn't used gradually loses strength. A person who has systematically avoided honest expression for the sake of connection often finds, when they finally try to be direct, that they don't know how anymore. The words feel unfamiliar. The discomfort feels unbearable, disproportionate to what's actually being risked. This is what fear of abandonment does to character over time. It doesn't just cause specific compromises, it dismantles the internal infrastructure that honesty depends on, piece by piece, so gradually that the person rarely notices the dismantling until they try to locate their own voice and find less of it than they expected. Stoic practice offers a direct countermeasure here, and it's simpler than most people expect. Small, consistent honesty practiced deliberately in low-stakes situations as a way of rebuilding the muscle. Saying a true but mildly unpopular opinion in a low-risk setting. Declining a request that doesn't actually work for you without over-explaining. These small acts are not about being harsh or contrarian. They're about restoring, through practice, the basic capacity to let your actual judgment reach your actual speech, without a fear-based filter intercepting it first. This is slow work, but it directly reverses the process that caused the erosion in the first place. Number 4. What happens to relationships built on this fear? There's a difficult truth in Stoic thinking about relationships that many people resist at first. A relationship maintained through fear of abandonment is not actually secure, no matter how long it lasts. It's built on a foundation of one person's ongoing self-suppression, and foundations like this don't produce real intimacy. They produce something that looks like intimacy from the outside, while remaining, on the inside, a careful performance designed to prevent a specific outcome. The other person in the relationship is not actually known by someone operating this way, because that person has never fully shown up as themselves. This creates a strange and painful irony. The very strategy used to prevent abandonment often guarantees a kind of abandonment anyway, just a quieter version of it. If a person never shows their real opinions, real preferences, real boundaries, then the version of them that exists in the relationship is not really them. When that relationship ends, or when the person finally reveals their true self after years of suppression, it can feel to both people like a stranger has shown up. The partner or friend who thought they knew this person discovers that a significant portion of them was never actually present. This is a form of abandonment too, the abandonment of the real self, hidden even from the people closest to it. Epictetus taught that a person should distinguish sharply between things that are truly theirs, like judgment, character, and choice, and things that only appear to be theirs, like reputation, other people's opinions, and the continuation of specific relationships. A relationship, in this framework, is something a person can invest in and value deeply, but it is never fully theirs to control or guarantee. Treating a relationship's survival as something that must be secured at any cost, including the cost of one's own honesty, is treating an external thing as though it were internal and controllable. This confusion is exhausting to maintain and impossible to sustain indefinitely, because the world does not actually cooperate with the illusion that any relationship can be permanently guaranteed through enough self-management. There's also a cost to the other person in these relationships, one that's rarely discussed. Someone constantly managing their behavior to prevent abandonment often, without meaning to, creates a subtle pressure on the other party. The other person can sense, even if they can't name it, that they're interacting with a curated version of someone rather than the full person. This can create its own strange distance, a feeling of never quite reaching solid ground with someone who seems agreeable but never fully present. Ironically, the very fear-driven behavior meant to keep someone close can create the emotional distance it was trying to prevent, because real closeness requires two full people showing up, not one person and one careful performance. Stoicism suggests a different foundation entirely. Relationships built on honest character, where both people know they are seeing something real, even when that real thing includes disagreement, boundaries, and occasional friction. This kind of relationship is more fragile in one sense, because it isn't propped up by constant appeasement, and some relationships genuinely won't survive a person showing up honestly. But it's far stronger in the sense that matters most. What does survive is real. A friend who stays after hearing an honest, disagreeable opinion is actually a friend to the real person. A friend who is only ever getting the managed, fear-adjusted version was never quite a friend to anyone at all, only to a performance. This is a hard teaching, and the Stoics knew it was hard. Marcus Aurelius wrote often about accepting that some things worth having require accepting loss as a real possibility. A person who wants relationships built on truth has to accept that truth sometimes costs relationships. This isn't a comfortable trade, but it's an honest one, and Stoicism consistently favors the honest, difficult path over the comfortable, false one, because only the honest path produces something durable enough to be worth having in the first place. Number 5, rebuilding character on a different foundation. The path out of this pattern doesn't start with dramatic confrontations or sudden personality changes. It starts with a shift in what a person treats as the actual measure of a good decision. For someone governed by fear of abandonment, the measure has quietly become, did this keep the person close? Stoic practice asks for a different measure entirely. Was this action in line with my own honest judgment about what is right, fair, and true, regardless of the outcome it produces in another person's behavior? This shift sounds simple when stated plainly, but it requires undoing years of habit, and it has to be practiced deliberately in specific real situations, not just understood intellectually. A useful starting point is the practice the Stoics called examining impressions before acting on them. When a fear-based impulse arises, the impulse to agree, to stay silent, to avoid a needed boundary, a person can pause and ask a direct question. Is this fear about the actual situation, or is this the old pattern activating automatically? This single pause, repeated consistently, begins to create separation between the automatic fear response and the actual choice a person makes. Over time, this separation grows, and what used to feel like an involuntary reaction starts to feel like an actual decision point, which is exactly the shift that restores agency to a person who has spent years feeling like their behavior around others was simply out of their hands. Seneca wrote to his friend Lucilius about the value of reviewing each day honestly before sleep, asking not whether the day went well by external measures, but whether one's actions matched one's principles. This practice applies directly here. A daily, honest review. Did I say what I actually believe today? Did I hold a boundary I needed to hold? Did I let fear of someone's reaction override my own judgment? And if so, where exactly did that happen? This isn't about self-punishment for the moments it happened. It's about building the kind of clear-eyed awareness that makes the pattern visible enough to eventually interrupt, rather than letting it continue running silently in the background of every interaction. Rebuilding character also requires practicing small acts of honest risk deliberately, not waiting until a crisis forces the issue. This might mean stating a genuine preference in a low-stakes setting, disagreeing respectfully with a minor point, or declining a small request without an elaborate justification attached. These acts feel disproportionately uncomfortable to someone with this pattern, because the fear response doesn't scale to the actual size of the risk. It treats every instance of honest self-expression as equally dangerous. Practicing in small, survivable doses is how a person retrains that response, proving to themselves repeatedly that honest expression does not, in fact, produce the catastrophic abandonment the fear has always predicted. There's also a deeper reorientation available here, one the Stoics return to constantly, building an internal sense of worth that doesn't depend on any particular person's continued presence. This doesn't mean becoming indifferent to other people or pretending relationships don't matter. It means locating one sense of being fundamentally acceptable somewhere more stable than another person's approval, specifically in one's own consistent effort to act with honesty, fairness, and courage. A person anchored this way can still deeply value their relationships, still grieve real losses, still want closeness, but they no longer need any single relationship to survive in order to feel like a person of worth, because their worth was never actually located there to begin with. What emerges from this work, slowly and without drama, is a person whose presence in any relationship is fully real. They say what they think. They hold boundaries when boundaries are needed. They risk disagreement when disagreement is honest. Some relationships that depended on their old, managed silence may not survive this change, and that loss is real and sometimes painful. But what remains and what gets built afterward rests on solid ground rather than fear. This is the quiet, undramatic outcome Stoicism points toward. Not a life free of the desire for connection, but a life where connection is no longer purchased at the price of one's own honest character. That trade, once a person sees it clearly, is one that a well-examined life refuses to keep making. If this video helped you see something in your own life more clearly, consider staying with this channel. New videos on Stoic thinking and practical character building come regularly, and the next one might be exactly what you need to hear.